Hello and welcome to episode 89 of the Chills at Will podcast. It's a pleasure to be joined by Luke Epplin. Who is Luke? Luke Epplin's writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, Page Turner, The Washington Post, GQ, Slate, Salon, The Daily Beast, among others, and he has appeared in such places as NPR's Weekend Edition, The New York Times, the MLB Network, and ESPN. He is the author of Our Team, the epic story of four men in the World Series that changed baseball, about Bob Feller, Larry Doby, Bill Veeck, Satchel Paige, and the Cleveland Indians of the 1940s. And this is not in your bio as well, but you're a big Charlie Brown fan, right?
I am. Yeah, I'm a huge Peanuts fan.
Oh, man, it's getting to be that time of the year. We got the Charlie Brown Christmas coming up.
Yeah, and the Great Pumpkin right
Oh, of
now.
course. How could I forget? It's a pleasure to have you. How are you today?
Hey, I'm doing good. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining me. Just finished the book, so steeped in the Cleveland Indians of lore, and just so interesting, so much to talk about. And again, congratulations on the book. It's not just a sports book for sure.
Thank you.
Right, and that's truly a compliment. Growing up you were just in St. Louis. What was your relationship to language, to reading? Were you always with your nose in a book? What was your relationship with words?
Actually, I grew up in a small town outside of St. Louis.
Okay.
It's a farming community, about 5,000 people. And I was somebody who was extremely interested in reading from an early age, but there was just no literary culture to be spoken of in that town. If you said you were going to be a writer, it'd be like saying you wanted to go to Mars. There was
Wow.
there was no roadmap, no way to make that happen. And so I don't think that when I was a kid, I had it in my mind that I was going to be a writer, even though at that age, I was a voracious reader.
Mm. What were some of the books that you were reading? Who were some of the writers? I mean, were you reading, kind of like above your age? Were you reading the classics, the Dr. Seuss's, the, into the S.E. Hittens, and also, sorry, where did sports books come into play there too?
Well, because there wasn't a lot of literary culture and a lot of guidance in that area, in my high school, there was no advanced classes, no AP or anything like that. And so I didn't have a good sort of reading list to cull from at that time. So whatever I discovered, I sort of discovered on my own. I started off like a lot of kids in middle America with things like Stephen King and John Grisham and things like that. But eventually just kind of learned that if we ever went to St. Louis and got to go to the mall, I would go into the bookstores and would go to the literature section and sort of pull down things that I'd either sort of vaguely heard of or that I enjoyed the covers of. And so I was, introduced to Hemingway and Steinbeck and all of these other sorts of things that I just had to sort of navigate on my own. Luckily, my father is a huge baseball fan. We were in Cardinal country there, so I grew up a diehard Cardinal fan, continue to be a diehard Cardinal fan. And he had a nice shelf of baseball books at home, mainly people like Roger Kahn, The Boys of Summer, and David Halberstam, who I would say is probably the biggest influence of my own baseball writing. He did a book called October 1964, which was about how the Cardinals integrated their team heavily in the late 1950s, and by the 1960s had players like Lou Brock and Bob Gibson and Curt Flood on the team, and that allowed them to take on the big bad New York Yankees, who, because they had such tremendous success in the 1950s, were slow to integrate. And by the time the 60s came around, the fact that the Yankees were not as caught up on integration as the Cardinals gave the Cardinals an edge over them. And so that book certainly was a major influence on our team.
Oh, wow. So is it true that St. Louis has a monopoly on playing baseball the right way?
Well, I would say this, that St. Louis is a club that is blessed by fortune. We are a very spoiled fan base. We win World Series that we should not win. We make it into the postseason whenever we have no business being in there. Things seem to break our way an irrationally high number of times. And one of the hardest things that I had with this book was that I was writing about Cleveland, and that fandom is the complete opposite of St. Louis, where you have a fan base that is used to things going completely wrong. They lose games that they should win. They lose World Series that they should win. That's happened to them numerous times. And so you have a fan base that, unlike St. Louis, which sort of expects things to turn out okay, they have to shield themselves and sort of cynicism and other sorts of things because they are always waiting for the roof to cave in on them. And that has gone all the way back to the history of that franchise. So it is a completely different mindset of the fan base.
That's a great point. Back to David Halberstam, you know, the great. Did he also write the book, and the title escaping me, the one about like one of the, I think, Dom DiMaggio and like the relationships. Do you know what I'm talking about? That was also David Halberstam.
Yeah, it's called The Teammates, and it was about Johnny Pesky, Dom DiMaggio, and Ted Williams. And it was the sort of way that he wrote it was that it was about Dom DiMaggio going down to see Ted Williams when he was on his last days, to try to reconnect with him. Also, and Bobby Dorr was one of the figures. And that book was also influential to me because it took those four men, DiMaggio, Dorr, Pesky, and Williams, and sort of intercut between them, which is something that I do in my book as well. So yeah, Halberstam sports writing, I would say, was perhaps the biggest, at least, influence when it came to sports writing.
Right. I'm so impressed by the way that you do the narrative in the book. I mean, I'm sure it was a lot of editing.
Yeah.
And you know, you change one thing and you got to change something else around, but you know, it comes off as incredibly seamless. You know. So,
thank you.
Yeah, very well done on that. How about sports? Were you the one reading about sports and watching sports, or were you into playing yourself?
I was into playing myself. I was a big runner back in high school. I was the captain of the track team, went to state all 4 years, and that was my strength. And so in terms of baseball, what I could do in Little League was get these sort of little dinky grounders and outrun the throw. And then I could just sort of steal bases and stuff like that. But by the time you got into high school, I could no longer do that. Players were a little bit too good. So I dropped baseball right around 7th or 8th grade, moved into track and basketball. So I was certainly somebody who played sports year round in my school. My dad has season tickets to the Cardinals, or at least he split it with several people. So we would go to Cardinal games, you know, once a month or something like that. And my dad carried around a portable radio with him wherever he went so that he could listen to the Cardinal games at all times. And so baseball was sort of the background noise of my childhood. So I've been wanting to write about baseball for a long time.
Were you lucky enough to get Bob Costas then? Was he
the people that I was lucky enough to have Jack Buck, and Mike Shannon were the two people. And Jack Buck was, I mean, he's classic, and his voice was the voice of my childhood.
Right. Oh, definitely. So as you got older, as you got into, you know, the high school and the college, what else were you reading? Who else really, you know, gave you the title of the podcast, the chills at will, the thrills? You know, did you continue with a lot of nonfiction? You know, who were the writers who really, even to today, who continue to thrill you?
I was really into fiction when I was growing up. I would say the first person who gave me the chills at wills was a writer named William Saroyan. I was a young kid, probably 13 or so, and I remember reading his book called The Human Comedy. And around the first sort of 2 chapters, I felt like the paragraphs were making me sort of stand up out of bed and just kind of hold it above my head and say, this is it. This is what I want to be doing. It really sort of was a visceral experience for me to feel those sort of sentences. And so I searched out fiction writers that could give me that sort of feeling. As I got into college, I found that more in people like Alice Munro, who I think is probably still my favorite contemporary writer at work, John Cheever, I don't know, Ann Beattie, Deborah Eisenberg, all of these great short story writers. I used to, when I was in college, take like a John Cheever story and just write the entire thing by hand from the book, just to
Whoa.
sort of like get into the flow of his sentences. I do the same thing with Alice Munro, just to kind of feel like, what would it be like to write these sentences? And then, I mean, I certainly wasn't copying them or plagiarizing them, but just kind of trying to feel how that style felt as you actually wrote it out.
Wow.
So that would be the sort of thing. Or I would take an Alice Munro story, go into my dorm room and just read the entire thing aloud to myself and sort of hear the flow of the language. So I was very much into sort of, I guess, what I would call lyrical realism. That's what I was gravitating toward.
Wow, just that image of literally copying every single word. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And so I mean, so what came out of that? I mean, you felt like a sense of empathy, if that's the word. You really did feel like you lived it along with them.
Yeah, I guess that, like, if you are trying to then write your own things as well, it's hard to come up with your own voice and your own style and things like that. And so figuring out the styles of other writers and how they feel on the page and how they sound out loud and things like that can help you sort of locate a voice that could be wholly your own. Obviously, whenever you first start to write, I think that you are going to be more imitating people that you admire, and that's inevitable. And so I was trying to write stories in the vein of Alice Munro and others, things like that. I was really focused on fiction at that time. Um, and it just took a long time to sort of break out of that. And I don't think I found nonfiction until a little bit later in life. I was really gravitating towards people that were writing nonfiction in the style of novels. So people like Lauren Hildenbrand, who wrote Seabiscuit. I really liked the writing of Gay Talese. He was using sort of devices from fiction, scenes and settings and all these sorts of things that made his work read like a novel. David Halberstam obviously is another huge one. And so that's where I thought, if I'm perhaps not the best fiction writer, I could at least apply the tools that I had learned from really studying fiction to a nonfiction book.
When you're talking about Cheever, and I feel bad, I haven't read enough. I feel like I get him and like even Updike, and there's another one that I almost get them kind of confused.
Yeah.
Cheever, I believe. Can you remember the story that he wrote? It's about a kind of a classic waspy family, and they go to like Cape Cod.
That could be basically any Cheever story.
Right. Tifty, I want to say, is one of the kids.
Oh yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? That's always one, and it did stand out to me, and I can't remember the title, so that kind of goes against my argument. But that's a story that definitely stood out to me. The imagery and just kind of that family that's almost like a soap opera that's supposed to have it all but doesn't.
Yeah, there's a I mean, there is a classic book of the sort of collected stories of John Cheever. It has a bright red cover with a big C on the front, and some of the early stories are a little bit tougher to get through, but then you hit that middle part and it's just every story just sings and illuminates, and you feel this sort of, I mean, he's talking a lot about sort of suburban ennui and alcoholism and sort of family breakdown and things like that, but he's doing it in such a sort of lyrical and perceptive way that I think even raises him above Updike. Updike, I feel like sometimes is in love with his own language, and in that way is more interested in surface than depth. But Cheever is not. Cheever I would put right up there with Alice Munro. William Trevor is another one who I really, really love. He's a great short story writer. And then the person that I would consider to be sort of the great ancestor of that sort of writing is Anton Chekhov.
Okay, of course.
Chekhov, I mean, you can read a Chekhov story and read a Cheever story and see sort of a direct link between the two. I think Chekhov was inventing that sort of small modern drama short story where not a lot happens, but then it seems like everything happens. The collected stories of Chekhov are sort of a Bible for me.
Yeah, that's a great line. You're right.
Mhm.
waspy, Massachusetts, could be any of his stories, right?
Yeah, definitely.
I assume that you're familiar with Where Have You Gone, Joe DiMaggio? Is that the name of the Gay Talese piece about?
Yeah, it's actually called The Silent Hero. It's like the silent season of the hero. And
Yes.
it's an absolutely incredible story thing because he
Yes.
goes to San Francisco and basically tries to convince Joe DiMaggio to hang out with him, and
Mm-hmm.
DiMaggio is reluctant to. But it's also it's told like a short story.
Mm.
With Gay Talese being one of the primary protagonists, and then sort of trailing Joe DiMaggio.
Mm.
There's a line in that story where Joe DiMaggio is in spring training with the Yankees, where he's much older. This is way past when he's retired, and he's kind of goes to the batter's box as an older man
Yeah.
and starts hitting line drives
Mm.
like he did as a younger man. And the older fans in the stadium who are watching this are all cheering, and Gay Talese says something um, like the fans were cheering as if to say, "We're young again. It's yesterday." And
Yeah.
I kind of pilfered that line in my book whenever
Mm.
Bob Feller comes back from the war and he starts his first game with the Indians, and he strikes out the very first batter he faces after 4 years in the war, and the crowd just goes crazy in Cleveland.
Right.
And it's because the war is over. That was the indication. That's whenever
Mm.
they could say, okay, World War II is done. Feller
Mm-hmm.
struck out a batter. And so I kind of like use the rhythm of that section from Gay Talese to sort of settle into
Mm-hmm.
the rhythm of why the crowd was so cheerful of that. I mean, pilfered is
Right.
the wrong word. I was sort of inspired by
Sure.
Gay
Yeah,
Talese
definitely.
when I did
Definitely.
that.
Yeah, I don't know how to speak to. It seems like he's gotten himself in some trouble in recent years, Gay Talese, and I don't know what to say to that. But in his own aging, but yeah,
Yeah.
the same thing with his piece about Frank Sinatra. There's just that idea of the older I get, the better I was, and
Yeah.
the nostalgia. Same thing. Like you said, that great scene with DiMaggio in the batter's box. Years after, and
Yeah.
Sinatra's got his cold, and
Yeah.
he's grumpy because he's not really that theme always comes through for sure.
Definitely.
Who are you reading these days? Especially nonfiction. Well, either way.
Yeah, well, one of the books that really inspired my own book was this book by Mark Harris, called Pictures at a Revolution. And it's a nonfiction book that takes as its subject the 1967 Oscar race. And so he takes all five best pictures, and that was The Graduate, In the Heat of the Night, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Bonnie and
Mm.
Clyde, and Dr. Dolittle, and sort of uses the narratives of how those pictures came to be to paint a picture of how Hollywood was radically changing in the
Uh,
1960s.
right.
And he, instead of sort of doing a chapter on The Graduate and a chapter on The Night, et cetera, he
Mm.
interweaves these
Yeah.
stories sort of in a seamless way. And so that was a tremendous model for me when I
Mm-hmm.
was coming up with my own book. How could you tell four, in Harris's case, five different stories that are
Mm-hmm.
all sort of coming to a head at the end,
Mm-hmm.
and make them all seem um, equally interesting and sort of connected to each other, even if it wasn't always apparent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I've really enjoyed his. He just did a book, a biography of Mike Nichols, which is absolutely incredible. I
Oh.
think he's amazing. Um, so yeah, I really like I mean, I think that like anybody else, I really like Eric Larson. He just did a book on Winston Churchill, which is a master of the nonfiction form.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm really sort of interested in these nonfiction writers that are trying to think of their subject matter in terms of story, narrative, person, things like that, rather than sort of a dry history.
Mm-hmm.
Or I guess in a baseball book, somebody who's really just writing about statistics and things like that. There are very few statistics in my book. Like I really
Right.
just
Right.
wanted to focus on the people and the story. The narrative
Yeah.
was the primary thing for me. So I'm attracted to people who think that way.
Wow, that is very interesting. That you're right. I mean, there are very few stats.
Yeah.
I really I remember I'm reading the part, Satchel, like, towards the end of the year where he kind of got put in the bullpen. He had a really good start with his time with
Yeah.
the Indians. and I was kind of like, okay, what was his, he won 4 games.
Yeah.
Like what was his ERA? But that didn't last.
Right.
But that didn't last long. It was like
Yeah.
I could always look that
Well,
up. It is about the storyline. Yeah.
yeah, well, that's what I figured. I thought that if you wanted to know what Larry Doby batted in 1948, you can just Google it on the internet and it's
Sure.
right there. But the sort of things that I'm pulling out of the archives are things that you can't Google easily. So I kind of thought that statistics kind of cluttered the narrative. I also even kind of thought that kind of games cluttered the narrative.
Mm.
Like in 1948, the last section of my book is on 1948, and I don't go like, then the Indians went to New York and won 2, and then they went to Philadelphia and won 3, and then they came home and lost. Like I'm picking sort of seminal moments and
Right.
trying to build a scene around them. I'm trying to tell everything in scene rather than in summary. And so, you can sort of just say the Indians had a rough June or something like that. And if you want to figure out how they did in June, you can go look it up. But I'm really trying to sort of keep the narrative focused on sort of seminal moments that reveal who these people are as people.
Mm-hmm. You just a small point. You referenced Laura Hillenbrand, and I'm not one of those guys at all who's into like, oh, military generals and strategy, and
Yeah.
there's that big group and they're really like World War II and like, no. But man, her book Unbroken,
Yeah.
Mike, I mean, just the amount of research and the
Yeah.
stories, and when she does do, let's say, stats, like I'll never forget how much she was writing about how many deaths came from like training,
Yeah.
things you never think about. I mean, the amount of research in that was just impeccable and incredible, right?
It's really amazing how much she can, I mean, some of the problems that I had with my book was that I had to keep it at a manageable length.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my original manuscript was like twice what the book ended up
Whoa.
being, because you could
Whoa.
just go on and on and on and on. And so her sort of ability to pack her books with so much information while
Mm-hmm.
keeping the narrative very tight and not sort of
Yes.
overwhelming the reader and writing a 1,000-page book. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's an incredible skill
Uh-huh.
to have. And
Yeah.
I write about World War II in my book, and I had to be sort of very fast, so I had to sort of speed through it. But
Mm-hmm.
I just haven't quite learned how to put in every single thing that, I mean, not every single thing, but a
Yeah.
lot of the stuff that you find into a narrative that can remain quick on its feet and
Mm-hmm.
things like that. And she is just the master at that.
She is. It's great to know your philosophy, or kind of how you came up, so to speak, where you really, you veered away from fiction in your own writing, but
Yeah.
you definitely have the positive, the really good things, the things that bring us to fiction. I'm so impressed about how the research you did is, um, it's not, it's so seamlessly put in there. I keep saying seamlessly, but I look at you know days when you reference the weather, days when you reference what they were thinking, and it's like there's no need for a footnote. It doesn't clutter it up. It's like, oh, okay. And you really do weave an incredible narrative that is, of course, backed by fact, in that nonfiction way.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of problem with the book that I wrote is that it's set mainly in the mid 40s, 1946 to 1948. And so a lot of the people, I mean, all 4 main characters have died, and I
Mm-hmm.
never got to a chance to speak with them. And so one of the things that I never wanted to do was to pretend like I could go into their heads and understand what they're thinking. And so
Mm-hmm.
anytime you get a thought from them, it's because this character said something in an interview at some point. And so
Mm-hmm.
you really need to sort of go deep into the archives to try to find
Mm-hmm.
uh interviews and random newspapers and things like that
Mm-hmm.
so that you can make sure that Larry Doby's very first at bat in the major leagues, you have to sort of like piece together what he felt about it through
Yeah.
numerous interviews that he gave throughout his
Uh-huh.
life. You can't just enter into his head. And so, I mean, that's the sort of frustration with being a nonfiction writer, because like if you were a fiction writer, you could just go
Mm-hmm.
deep on what Larry Doby was thinking in
Mm-hmm.
those moments, but you're really confined by what these characters said and didn't say throughout their
Mm-hmm.
lives.
Mm-hmm. You definitely see some familiar names in your acknowledgments. Veeck, some of his ancestors, or not his ancestors, his descendants,
his
etc.
family.
Yeah. Did you get to talk to Dobies and Pages and Fellers?
I did, yeah. I talked to Larry Doby's son. Unfortunately, Dobby was very young when the story takes place. My story basically ends at 1948, and so he had not had children by that point, and so the kids have no living memory of that. And I guess that Larry Doby was very reticent. He himself was an introvert. He was quiet. He was not very talkative. He did not particularly enjoy interviews. His son sort of confirmed that it was very difficult to get his dad to talk about anything in terms of his career. So he was certainly the hardest player to get into. Paige's family, for I think it was his 120th birthday, maybe, all gathered together in Kansas City, maybe in 2018, and did a big panel talking about their father. And it was extremely illuminating to hear about him as a family man, because Satchel Paige is such a larger than life figure. He's almost like a folkloric person, but then to hear just Satchel Paige in the kitchen and like doing just normal things from their family was really illuminating. So I did manage to talk to all four people's families.
Nice. We'll get back to the book real quick. What was a Eureka moment or Eureka moments for you when you were like, I can do this, I can write, people want to read it, I'm good at this, or you got some feedback from somebody you respected? When did that kind of kick in?
I'll give you the genesis of how this book came about. I'm from near St. Louis. My dad is a Cardinals fan, but my grandpa was a fan of the St. Louis Browns. Now, St. Louis used to have two Major League Baseball teams, the Cardinals, who were pretty good usually, and the Browns, who were pretty terrible. Right. The Browns left for Baltimore and became the Orioles in the mid-1950s. But before then, my grandpa was a huge fan of them. And so I grew up hearing about this team that had long left St. Louis by the time I was born. So I knew more about the Browns than a lot of people my age. And anybody who knows anything about the Browns knows that Bill Veeck was the last owner of the team. He did some of his most notorious stunts on the Browns. Most notably, he brought a little person to the plate to bat.
Eddie Gale? No.
Eddie Goodell. Yeah. And, he did the same sort of things he did in Cleveland. He shot off fireworks. He did sort of wild giveaways. He did all the sort of stuff to excite fans and bring them into the stadium. And so I wanted to write about Bill Veeck and the Browns to sort of, honor my grandpa, things like that. And it was really while researching Veeck, I went back to some archives earlier in his life. He had been the owner of the Cleveland Indians before he was the owner of the Browns. So I thought, I should just do a little bit of research on Veeck and the Indians so that I understand how he got to the Browns. While I was doing research with Veeck and the Indians, I kept seeing in the newspapers these other names just sort of constantly reappearing: Bob Feller, Satchel Paige, Larry Doby. And I was thinking to myself that Veeck's most important contribution that he did to the game of baseball was to integrate the Indians. They were the first American team to integrate, American League team to integrate very shortly after the Brooklyn Dodgers integrated with Jackie Robinson. He was very outspoken in his support of integration, and he was very patient with Larry Doby whenever he came up, and he took a chance on Satchel Paige, who was in his mid-40s by the time that Veeck signed him. So he was a figure who I think doesn't get enough credit in terms of integration. And I thought if you took these four men, two white men with Bill Veeck and Bob Feller, who had very different views on integration. Feller was more of a traditionalist, Veeck was a progressive. And then you took these two black men, Larry Doby and Satchel Paige, who came from extremely different generations, so much so that they really didn't get along at all. They did not like each other. You could tell a very full story of integration and all of the sort of views that were swirling around. And the Eureka moment happened when I was reading articles about the 1948 World Series. And at the very end, this is not a spoiler, the Indians win the World Series. And at the very end, Bob Feller is sitting in the locker room kind of by himself, just, he didn't do very well in the World Series. And so he feels like he's not entitled to celebrate. And Larry Doby sees him sitting by itself and goes over and sort of cheers him up, shakes his hand and things like that. And I thought to myself, there you go. There's the book. I mean, you've got you've got this extremely popular white superstar who once was the most popular baseball player in all of America, kind of turned into a forgotten man on a team that now featured two Black superstars. And I thought, wow, like this is the scene that I'm going to be building toward throughout the entire book.
Oh man. Oh, so cool. So
Yeah.
cool. I've been lucky to talk to like Eric Nussbaum, who wrote about Chavez
Great book.
Ravine, right? Bradford Pearson wrote about like the Japanese American internment camps and football and I've been so lucky to talk to people like that, and I feel like, and definitely as a compliment, you're part of like that group that really is, not that it's never been done before, of course it has. You talk about David Halberstam and many others, but who really, these are sports books that are not just about sports. There's a lot of like reckoning, I guess. I know that word's probably overused these days, like, racial reckoning, and just, there's no, Bob Feller's not a hero in the book. He's shown as he is.
Yeah.
He's shown as he is, and he's put in juxtaposition to the other characters and like that. And so I feel like it's a nice little club you're part of. And your titles are so long these days, huh? Man. Is that a marketing thing, or
well, my original title for the book was The First Fine Careless Rapture. That was what I wanted the book to be titled, because Bill Veeck, late in his life, in the 1970s, the Indians had fallen on extremely hard times. They could barely fill that giant stadium in which they played. There were, a couple thousand people coming to each game. The team was terrible. The fans had lost interest. There was talk that the Indians were going to move to Seattle in the 1970s and become the Mariners, basically. And so a lot of people said the only thing that can save the Indians is if Bill Veeck came back and was the owner of the team again. And so people went to go interview him, and he was kind of semi-retired at that point. And they said, well, why don't you come back and buy the Indians and do what you did in the 40s? And he would always say, you can never recapture the first fine careless rapture. And so I thought that title was great, because every one of these men, whether it's Page, Feller, Dobby, or Veeck, kind of culminates with this 1948 World Series. And then as I kind of show in the epilogue, like what seemed like it was only going to be a beginning turns out to kind of be an end for them. These men would chase that feeling, the first fine careless rapture that they experienced in 1948, the rest of their lives, and never again recapture it.
Definitely. Bill Veeck, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about him. I mean, he's, Barnum Bailey, right? I mean, he's a hustler. He's obsessive. He's comes from money. I don't know if you call him new money.
Yeah.
But goes out of his way to not wear the cap and the shirt and tie. Yeah. How much of that do you think was an affect, and how much of that you think was truly him?
He's a really interesting, complex character. His dad was the president of the Chicago Cubs, and so he grew up around baseball, was going to the stadium with his father from a very early age. And by the time he turned 18, he already knew as much about baseball operations as somebody who was in his 40s. And so he had this extremely privileged early start that came from that. And the family was pretty wealthy because of his father's position, but he always sort of identified with the common man. And I think his wife said at one point that he was born on the nice side of the track and then dragged himself over to the other side. He could really play both sides. So if he needed to go to where the money men were and sort of say, can I have this money to go buy a team? He knew how to do that, and he could run in those circles. But at the same time, he loved to do nothing more than to go to a bar or a truck stop or something like that and just talk to the common people for hours and hours and hours. He was somebody, I always thought of him as kind of a humanist above all. But I think some of his most interesting ideas were that he was of the firm opinion that the sort of competitive play on the baseball field could coexist with theatrical sideshows. And so he really thought that fans needed a little bit more than just a baseball game. And so he was dedicated to putting bands in the music between innings, shooting off fireworks, doing giveaways, having clowns and contortionists and all sorts of things. He really thought that like people would show up to sort of see that sort of stuff, and then they would stick around for the baseball game, and maybe through watching the baseball game they would cultivate new fans. And it seemed like everywhere he went he was setting attendance records because people were really eager to see what Bill Veeck was going to do. And so he had this sort of great sort of skill set where he had an incredible baseball mind. He was so good at doing trades and signing players and like, you know, going into the Negro leagues and finding Larry Doby. But he also was, you know, he was a showman. He was a hustler, and he knew how to publicize himself. I think that sort of not wearing a tie and not wearing a hat was a way to create a brand. And like, that's, people really connected to that. And he knew how to sort of like sell things to people. So he was just the whole package.
Definitely. You know, the second of the four main characters was Larry Doby, who we've, of course, talked about a little bit. He had the interesting experience where he knew, if not Deep South, he knew Mid South, you know, segregation and Jim Crow growing up in, I'm sorry, remind me of the town in
South Carolina and Camden.
Right, Camden, which reminds me of New Jersey, which is where he moved to, right? So he also, you know, he played on an integrated baseball team and basket, you know, sports teams.
Yeah.
And was, you know, which I think, you know, happens to a lot of kids, unfortunately. It's just that like they grow up into the world, and you know, where things were maybe fairly equal, now racism just rears its ugly head, right?
Yeah, he grew up in South Carolina until he was in high school. His mother moved up to New Jersey to get work as a sort of domestic worker. He claimed that when he was in South Carolina, he wasn't as cognizant of the segregation at that time. And when he went to high school, he became just such a tremendous athlete. He was a four-letter athlete. He led his football team to the New Jersey State Championship. He was batting over 500 as a baseball player. He could just kind of do everything. So popular that in his town of Paterson, New Jersey, they threw this big banquet for him downtown where they gave him tremendous gifts. They wrote poems about him. I mean, he was very celebrated. He really said that he didn't experience, or he didn't sort of feel racism until he got drafted into the Navy during World War II. And he's kind of on this train going over to the Naval Training Base, and all the white and the black recruits are together there. But as soon as they get off at the station, they're immediately separated and sent into segregated camps. And that's whenever it really hit him. He said that he wasn't expecting that, and he kind of, you know, was tremendously hurt by that experience. So he's a very sensitive individual, yet just extremely determined. You know, one of the great athletes that has ever come out of New Jersey.
He was, you know, you write about how, you know, at least a few cases, he was written about kind of in a, I mean, cringy is an understatement, a cringy way, as in, you know, really like that. What's the expression for it? I guess like, you know, respectability politics, right? Like, like he's like he, you know, you're a shining example of your race type of thing, which is just like, oh God, right?
Yeah.
Jackie Robinson had the same thing said about him, you know, because he had to. Branch Rickey had kind of like, you know, had that contract with him basically. But I do wonder about what differences you saw between, because there definitely were, between the way that Jackie Robinson, let's say, was treated, or that his debut happened, as well as Larry Doby's.
I mean, in some ways, I don't know if Dobby's experience was worse, but it was different and bad in other ways. Jackie Robinson came up through the Dodgers organization with Branch Rickey, and Rickey had this belief that you couldn't simply bring Robinson from the Negro Leagues to the major leagues. It would be too much of an abrupt thing, not only for him, but also for the white teammates. He believed that you needed to put Robinson into the minor leagues first to give him sort of an adjustment period to these all white spaces, but also give sort of these white teammates the sort of ability to adjust to the idea of integration. And so Robinson spends an entire year of 1946 in the minor leagues in Montreal. He leads that team to the minor league championship. And so by the time he comes up onto the Dodgers in 1947, people think that he has kind of earned his way onto that team
Right.
through what he did in the minor leagues, and people know who he is. And once he comes up in 47, he struggles for like a month and then sort of immediately starts taking off and gets the Dodgers into the World Series that year. And so he's also in New York City, which is the media capital of the country. Everything that he does is very well documented. And so if he is facing sort of racism, as he did in places like St. Louis, it's very well written about. It's all over the newspapers, things like that. Dobby, on the other hand, came up through Bill Veeck, and Veeck had a very different idea about integration than Branch Rickey. He thinks that if you put somebody in the minor leagues, it's going to put a little bit too much pressure on him, that he believed that the players in the Negro leagues were every bit as good as they are in the major leagues. He was obviously right about that. And he thought that you could just take some of the best players and throw them immediately into the major league fire. And so Dobby plays a game for the Newark Eagles. That's the team that he played on in the Negro Leagues on July 4th, 1947, boards an overnight bus that same day, goes to Chicago where the Indians are playing the White Sox. And on July 5th, he suits up for the Indians and comes to the plate. It was a real shock to his system. He would later say that the first 10 or so times he came to bat, he couldn't stop his teeth from chattering. The Indians teammates were not prepared for integration. They didn't know this was going to happen. And so a lot of them were very resentful of Larry Doby. They thought that he should have either gone down to the minors to sort of earn his spot, or they just didn't like the idea of it, period. One of the Indians players actually quits the team briefly because Larry Doby takes his place in the field. It was a very contentious situation. And the fact that Doby does not excel in the 1947 season, he becomes kind of a bench warmer, made it so that the media did not pay a lot of attention to him. So all the things that he had to deal with, whether it was the racial abuse from the crowds or the teammates, or just the sort of isolation that he is going through, is done almost, not in the way that it was with Robinson, where everything was so well reported on. So it's an extremely different scenario. And Robinson was 5 years older than Dobby, and so much more mature, huge difference for that. So I, in some ways, I think Larry Doby had it kind of worse.
As also Jackie Robinson was a UCLA track star. I mean, he was known.
Yeah. He was known by white fans as well. And Larry Doby certainly was not. I think not a lot of white ball players would have ever heard of him.
Right. And obviously not that all fiction has a clean, nice right off into the sunset ending either, but because it is nonfiction, oh man, they win it all in 48. There's a great moments, champagne, woo. And then one of the saddest parts of the book to me is the epilogue, where talking about how in recent, in years after that, there were literally players who wouldn't eat after he had eaten.
Yeah, I talked to there's an Indians equipment manager from 1949 through 1953 who's still alive.
Wow.
And he said that's what he would notice. That people wouldn't eat after Dobby, or if they were in like a really small dugout and there was only one stall and Larry Doby went to the bathroom, people would not go to the bathroom after Larry Doby, things like that. Yeah. And he used to, one of his jobs was to make sure that Dobby, when they arrived, because they all traveled by train back then, when they arrived to a new city, that Larry Doby had some means of transportation, because a lot of taxis would not pick him up. Doby would sometimes have to go to other hotels. He said that if Larry Doby came over to his house in Cleveland to sort of, prepare for a game or something like that, the neighbors would call the cops, because they were like, what's this black man doing in our neighborhood? So yeah, even though Larry Doby becomes this, he's a hero in 1948. He's really the reason why the Indians win the World Series that year. You can't end the story there. It's a very fleeting, and then things kind of regress right back to where they were.
Right. Yeah, and even the maybe quote unquote progressive-ish writers at the time, there was a lot of the, he's not getting the most out of his abilities and he's got to get out of his own head. And it's like, well, the things you write about, how would he not be in his head? How would he not be introspective? How would he not be isolated?
I think that there weren't a lot of at least white writers who were taking into account all
Mhm.
that off-field stuff and how the mental challenges that came with it. You could read a lot from the African American newspaper at the
Yeah.
time, like the Column Post, the Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro American, and there the black writers were really giving a lot more context
Mhm.
as to what Dobie was dealing with, as opposed to white players who would
Mhm.
usually just kind of show up at the city, get escorted to their hotel rooms and then be
Mhm.
able to just go out to dinner or something like that. I mean, those sorts of things for Dobie were very difficult to do. He often faced tremendous isolation that really weighed on him. He needed somebody to sort of talk to after the games about, particularly if he had a bad game, to sort of be able to get out of his head a little bit.
Mhm.
Instead, he would just be isolated.
Mhm. Obviously Satchel Paige. So Satchel Paige, I mean, I know there's questions about his birth certificate and everything. 1906-ish.
Yeah, 1906. I think that's
Right.
whenever. I think it's pretty well established that that's when he
Okay.
was born.
Okay. So I mean, even as bad as Larry Doby had it, there was even more brutal, virulent, in-your-face racism, in earlier times, right? And so Satchel Paige grew up in that. Grew up in that. He
Yeah.
grew up in Mobile, Alabama.
Mhm.
Yet he also had some certain privileges slash limitations. How would you compare his, like you said, he and Larry Doby did not get along,
Yeah.
generational, etc. How would you kind of compare the two and the way that they were brought into the league, the way that they were treated?
Page was somebody who was, yeah, grew up in the Deep South, extreme Jim Crow laws, lynchings, the whole thing around him.
Mhm.
And so he grew up in just abject poverty and became a really entrepreneurial minded individual from a very early age. He
Mm.
got his nickname Satchel because he would have to go down to the train station, pick up satchels, and he sort of figured out ways that he could pick up a lot of satchels and make a lot of money. This
Mhm.
was sort of a through line throughout his entire life. In the Negro Leagues during the Depression, in the sort of early 1930s or something like that. And a lot of teams were in just collapse or
Mhm.
just financially precarious. And so he sort of figured that he would build himself up into an individual attraction. And so he
Mhm.
became almost like a one-man franchise. He would
Right.
play for whatever team he was on, but then lease out his services to other teams and he would collect a cut of the gate, things like that. And he was extremely good at sort of well, he was good at perpetuating narratives about himself. He was really good at inventing and forwarding his own legend, and he became a
Mhm.
legend basically. But he was also good at just playing to the crowd whenever he needed to. He would slow walk to the mound. He had
Mhm.
this sort of very deadpan look on his face. He reminded some people of the actor Stepin Fetchit. And certain black players resented that because
Right.
they thought that that was a stereotype that white people could use for the sort of not so smart, kind of craven individual, something like that. And Page would play it up every once in a while to sort of cross over into white America if he could. But once the game started, that persona went away and he just got down to business. He was very adamant that pitching was serious. It was his livelihood. He took it very seriously. He did not clown around in you know games that meant something. Sometimes when he would lease out his services to like some local club in random place in the United States, he would definitely do things like send
Mhm.
people away and try to strike out the side on his own. He had these sort of wild windups where he would crank his arm. He definitely knew. I think he's very similar to Bill Veeck. He
Mhm.
knew how to excite fans, get people into the stands, build up his own notoriety and fame, while at the same time being an incredible baseball mind. I mean, just one of the most intelligent pitchers that has ever played the game. So he had both of those qualities, which is why I think whenever Veeck finally came together with Page, they clicked so well. They recognized in each other a very similar characteristic.
Right. Um, I know there's been a lot of revisionist history. I don't know if that's the word. A lot more look at the previously thought to be like the minstrel type of show, right? In the
Yeah.
past, and the kind of again, playing up to these negative stereotypes, and the idea that, a lot of people have now seen in more recent years and gone back and seen, these were tricksters. They knew what they were doing. This was survival, right? They had to do this sometimes to literally survive, right?
Yeah,
And,
which is why I think Larry Doby and Satchel Paige misunderstood each other. I think that by the time Dobby came along, that sort of persona that Paige had adopted was one that Larry Doby thought was detrimental to the integration experience that
I mean, he
that
told
he
him
was.
so, right? He told
Yeah,
Satchel that.
he was very critical of Page, and he remained so throughout the rest of his
Mm,
life. You can read later interviews with Dobby where he thought that Page perpetuated racism. And
mm,
Satchel Paige, I mean, he was 17 years older than Dobby, and had been such a legend that, I mean, he probably didn't pay very much mind to what Dobby was telling
sure.
him, but they just had fun, different philosophies and different ways of thinking about integration, and so they did not get along. And I mean, you have to remember that a lot of white players did not think that Negro League players were up to the standards of Major League Baseball. Bob Feller was one of them,
Hmm.
and a lot of them thought of these black ball players as more of like performers rather
Hmm.
than players. They thought that the Negro League style was much faster, a little more showy, and so they thought that, yeah, that really entertains a crowd, but what happens whenever they get in front of the World Series? They'll crumble because they don't have, quote unquote, the fundamentals
Hmm.
to make it through, or the sort of the mental makeup or something like that. This was the thinking back then. And so if Page was sort of the most popular player from the Negro Leagues, his sort of showiness seemed to cement in white players' minds that that's what he was. In fact, a lot of people, even when Page was going on his tremendous tear in 1948, referred to him in the newspapers as a clown pitcher. They would say
Wow.
clown pitcher Satchel Paige took the mound and
Wow.
shut out the White Sox. Um, and so that was, unfortunately, a lot of white writers
Hmm.
thought that way.
Well, I mean, the same outdated, the same racist mindset that, what was it? Doug Williams in 1988, 89 was the first black quarterback in the Super Bowl. That same
Yeah,
type of thinking, right?
definitely. Yeah, it's something that hasn't gone away. And
Hmm.
I mean, I think that you can see that even today in these quote unquote unwritten rules in
Yes,
baseball.
yes, yes, yes.
I think that the sort of expressive style of the Negro Leagues had to be sort of like, I mean, that was considered to be not real baseball. Whenever you got into the
Mm.
majors, you couldn't do that because that's not
Hmm.
how major league players acted. And so whenever people are now saying, oh, these bat flips or these the sort of celebrations after home runs is
Hmm.
not the way that you play the game, I think that that is an attitude that came from this idea of white baseball being juxtaposed against black baseball.
Definitely.
Yeah, so
Oh,
it's certainly that attitude that is carried over.
definitely. That's why, books like yours are so important, with the perspective that you have of 50, 60, 70 years later. I learned so much through the book about the crazy and amazing barnstorming tours, and about
Yeah,
how, again, I mean, you can make the comparison to the free agency and the players' rights of today, where they were doing their thing, and Bob Feller was out there, and Satchel Paige was out there, and they were playing in the Dominican Republic and Mexico and L.A., and
yeah.
how it was a huge source of income. So for some of them, even more than the regular season, right?
Yeah, well, you didn't have free agency back then. The
Mhm.
players were very limited in the leverage that they had to negotiate their contracts. And so a lot of these people had to work in the off season
Right.
to make ends meet. And so after the World Series ended, which was usually early October, they had a couple of weeks, usually until early November, to do what is known as barnstorming, where they would sort of form makeshift teams and go around the country and play in cities that did not have major league clubs in them and did
Mhm.
not get the chance to see major league baseball players. And so because these were exhibition games, they could do things that you couldn't do in a major league game. Most notably, teams of white major league players could face teams of Negro League players.
Mm-hmm.
And so usually you had these teams fronted by a superstar, sort of Rogers Hornsby or Dizzy Dean, or in this case, Bob Feller, whenever he became popular. And then you would try to find sort of the popular Negro League players, none more so than Satchel Paige.
Mm-hmm.
And so because Bob Feller and Satchel Paige became the two most popular, the two best pitchers in the sort of late 30s into the 40s, it was a sensation to see these two face
Mm-hmm.
off against each other. And so they knew that this was the best way to go. And so Feller and Paige formed a sort of mutually beneficial financial relationship together where they would agree to face off against each other in the off seasons. And they did it for many years.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's so cool that you talked about some of the seeds of the book being like, kind of like a tribute to your grandfather, right?
Yeah.
I thank you so much for the book again, because I feel like it brought me even closer to my grandfather, one of my heroes. I told you my grandpa Joe Albanese was a pitcher whose career was also interrupted by the war, similar like Bob Feller. He was a minor league pitcher. Whether he would have made the major leagues, who knows? But he always felt like when he came back from the war, he was a little bit too old, and and kind of gave it up. But he, most humble man to ever walk the earth. But we would always pull out of him the stories. A story about Satchel Paige. He played him in an exhibition, and I believe it was either in Tacoma or San Jose.
Cool.
I have the little newspaper clip. I got to take a look at it again that I just found recently. But he got 2 hits, and his story, his story was that Satchel did have the infielder lay down or sit down. And I don't know if I made up this part of the story, if I really heard it, but my understanding was that he got 2 hits up the middle, which is maybe my way of saying, they would have been hits anyway, right?
Right.
But such a cool story. And, I wrote a fiction piece a little bit after my grandpa passed away that was based on the story, and, just Satchel and how much of a character he was. And,
yeah.
Well,
a lot of people back then would sort of figure out if they were major league ready by facing Satchel Paige in the off season in these exhibition games. And they figured that if they could hit Satchel Paige, that they were ready for the majors. And, it was a tremendous challenge to do so. People like Joe DiMaggio would say that. And DiMaggio later in his life would say that Satchel Paige was the greatest pitcher he ever faced. He just had, he had such incredible control, and he could put the ball wherever he wanted to. There's legends of him sort of throwing over chewing gum wrappers and other sorts of things. He just had that. And it was an interesting sort of juxtaposition with Feller, who threw extremely hard but was very wild. And batters that would face Feller had to always be ready for the idea that a pitch could get away from Feller and come right at their heads. And so Feller was very intimidating to go against. Whereas Satchel Paige, if you were hit by Satchel Paige, it was probably because he meant to do so. Like he was not wild at all.
Yeah, that great story where he did his tryout with the Indians, and you wrote that he said put a handkerchief on the corners of the plate. Yeah, and went right over the plate. And then was it Lou Boudreau? Lou Boudreau. He's hired. Got him.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because Satchel Paige, like when Larry Doby comes into the majors, very much like Jackie Robinson does, he's given the speech where you can't fight back, you can't sort of talk back to people, you can't do all these things. Satchel Paige, I think, is the first Black player that comes into the majors that is not given that speech.
Yes.
And that tryout where he takes a handkerchief and sort of tells Boudreau to put it wherever he wants is a sort of indication of what he's going to do. Like, he's not going to alter his style from the Negro Leagues. He's the first Black player to come into the majors who is fully himself.
Yes.
And he, is still doing the sort of wind-ups and other things like that. He's throwing hesitation pitches, which is whenever he would pause at the top of his wind-up. He's doing all the things in the Negro Leagues that he did, including missing trains, kind of being late for things. And there were a lot of Black writers in African-American newspapers that were taking him to task for that and saying that this was bad, that he was giving a bad name to players, and that he needed to clean up his act and all that. But Satchel Paige was who he was, and he wasn't going to change that going into the majors. And so he was he was the first person to come in as fully himself, basically.
Definitely. I feel like there's room for Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby and Satchel Paige as trailblazers, or all those, those terms may be overused, but but they all had their, yeah, like you said, he was, while there were these allegations or people saying, oh, he's not good for the race or racism, he was himself, and he was, I would not say immune to racism, because of course not, but he just kind of put himself out there like, hey, I've heard it all before, screw you, you know?
Yeah, and like whenever he came into the majors, it was like, I mean, it's like if Paul Bunyan came into the majors. I mean, even
Legendary.
I talked to Eddie Robinson, who was the only living member of the Cleveland Indians, and he was just like, you know, I'd never seen Satchel Paige, but of course, like every other person at that age, I knew who he was. You know, he was a mythic figure. And so whenever he came onto the Indians, it provoked a frenzy across the nation. I mean, it was like Beatlemania or something. Like people were tearing down the turnstiles to get the chance to see him. Every time he was announced to pitch, it was just sellout after sellout after sellout. I mean, he was a sensation. There was just sort of nothing like him.
At the age of 42. Is it true that President Joe Biden cited your book in talking to Pope Francis the other day? Is that true?
It's false. No,
Okay.
He didn't cite my book, but he cited something that's in the book. I don't think he cited my book, but no, President Biden, if whenever he first came into office, somebody took a picture of his desk in the Oval Office, and he carries a 1953 Topps Satchel Paige baseball card on his desk. And so if you ever get a chance to sort of look at a picture of his desk, try to find the Satchel Paige card. Satchel Paige is obviously very important to him, and he likes to talk. He likes to tell stories about Paige.
And so the whole idea, right, with Pope Francis was like all three of us, including Satchel Paige, where we had our renaissance, we had a second career, or we were kind of thing, right? Basically, like we did great things at an advanced age. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's like, I think that Biden quoted the line that Paige would say, "How old would you be if you didn't know how old you were?" Because Paige himself, you know, he pitched into his late 40s in the major leagues, and he really should have continued on. In his very last year in the league, he was an all-star. And then because Bill Veeck had to sell the St. Louis Browns, no other major league owner picked up Paige, even though he had won 12 games the year before. So he went in, played minor leagues forever. I mean, he was pitching into his 60s. There was, I mean, his last appearance in the majors was in 1965 when he was 59. And he was, you know, he was signed as a stunt for the Kansas City Athletics as a way of, you know, bringing people to the ballpark. And he ended up pitching 3 scoreless innings against the Red Sox.
Oh my God.
I mean, there was only one person that got a hit off of him, and that was Carl Yastrzemski. And he was 59 years old. I mean, I mean, we'll never see anything like Satchel Paige again. I think he might be the most extraordinary athlete this country has ever produced.
Really? That's a great line. I knew he was old. I didn't know he was that old. Wow.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can, you know, talk a little bit more about Bob Feller, and especially in juxtaposition to Satchel Paige. You write about Bob Feller as, you know, the wonder kind from Iowa, you know, of course, a hard thrower phenom. He's from, you know, middle America. Yeah. And, you know, on page 40 of the book, you write about him as, quote, disciplined, earnest, and rural, coming across as a peach fuzz personification of the nativist sensibility.
Yeah.
That's some dang good writing by the way there.
Yeah, well, Feller, I think there's never been a player in any sport who has had a debut like Feller's. He came from a farm in Iowa, very small town. He sort of showed some tremendous ability from a very early age, and so his dad, who really sort of trained with him every day, cleared off a patch of their farmland and built him a baseball diamond right there among the cornfields. It was really the sort of original Field of Dreams. And it was also a laboratory that sort of allowed Feller to progress against people who were many years older than him. Through happenstance, he makes it onto the Indians at age 17. He's a high school junior. Right. And in his very first start for the Indians in 1936, he ties the American League record for strikeouts. 4 starts later, he ties the major league record for strikeouts. Again, he's 17. And he's so popular that in his senior year of high school, he makes the cover of Time magazine, and his high school graduation is broadcast live on NBC radio from coast to coast.
Gee.
I mean, he was a phenom. And there's
Mhm.
just no other way to say it. I mean,
Mhm.
he's kind of set the nation on fire. And I think one of the reasons why, besides the sort of amazing stuff he did on the field, why he resonated so much was because we had just gone through this tremendous depression where it seemed like the things that had gotten us into depression was the rapid urbanization and sort of
Mm.
mechanization of the United States, this sort of go-go time in the 1920s that crashed. And so during the 1930s, people really started to look back in time toward a simpler time,
Mm.
sort of more rural, agrarian sort of thing. You saw that in literature, you saw it in painting. And now you had this sort of personification who came
Yes.
out of Iowa. He grew up without running water or electricity. He sort of was somebody who built up his muscles by, hauling hay bales and stuff like that. He had a twang. He, talked about sort of the importance of, lifting yourself up by your bootstraps and all that. Like,
Mhm.
he was kind of the American dream writ large. He seemed
Mhm.
exactly the sort of figure that America was waiting for. And so, his story became front and center for every young baseball fan at that time, and it was told over and over and over again. And Feller, who was, he was from rural Iowa, but he was an extremely shrewd businessman.
Yes.
um, he recognized the power of his story, and he really played to that persona,
Mhm.
of this sort of aw shucks Iowa person while he was raking in the money.
Yes.
His father and him were not these yokels. They were very hard-headed businessmen,
Mhm.
and it continued throughout Feller's life. He was somebody who then did these elaborate barnstorming tours. He was the first person ever to incorporate himself as an athlete.
Whoa.
He built his own brand, and even later on in his life in the 1970s, he was the first sort of Hall of Fame player who would travel around to like minor league stadiums, put up a card table before games, and just put up a sign that said
Ah.
Bob Feller autographs $10. And if you
Oh.
read sort of newspaper clippings at that time, people thought it was undignified. They were like, oh gosh, he's really, imagine the sort of person that would do this. Now everybody does that. They all go to
Yes.
these shows and sign autographs and make a lot of money. Feller is sort of pioneering the business of being an athlete,
Mhm.
throughout his whole life.
Mhm. Yeah. I guarantee, I 100% guarantee that he would have had a podcast if he were in 2021, right? I
Oh
mean,
yeah,
I mean, didn't he have a
he
call? Didn't he have a column in the paper and
he
this?
had a
I mean,
radio show. He had a
yeah,
column in the paper. He
yeah.
he appeared on pretty much every show that you can imagine. Bob Hope and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
He was somebody who really sort of turned himself into a multimedia superstar.
right.
He wrote his autobiography before he turned 30. Like, he really understood the power of the media to perpetuate his own myth.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, let's face it. He was a spiritual ancestor to Jay-Z.
He was, yeah. I think that and I know that a lot of people were trying to compare Larry Doby and Satchel Paige, but I think that Feller and Page were kindred spirits in terms of that entrepreneurialism.
Mm-hmm.
I think
No
that
doubt.
Feller was the most entrepreneurial black athlete of his time, and I mean Page was, and Feller was the most entrepreneurial white athlete at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I don't think that they were tremendously good friends, I think that they each other, and they recognized that they could make money off of each other, and so they certainly did so. And so yeah, those two, I kind of have them linked in the book
Yes,
because
no doubt.
they're sort of inventing the way that an athlete can make money off of
Mm-hmm.
various means through their own narrative.
Bob Feller, I'm not a businessman. I'm a businessman, right?
Yeah, he was.
I
He
I
Yeah.
don't want, again, I don't want to give away too much, and not that it's giving away, but the way that you do build the story in 1948, and the way that the pennant race and the World Series is, it has to be experienced without, I don't want people to hear about it necessarily first. I want them to read the book for sure. I saw the picture twice, the picture of Larry Doby and Steve Gromek, right? One time, it's kind of in the middle of the book. So it's like, oh, okay, that's
Yeah.
interesting. Cool picture. And then, it's definitely even more resonant, at the end of the book, after you really do a great job at wrapping things up as much as you can, putting the storyline together. It's not. I'm always interested in that. I've heard about that in a lot of sports, or I guess not even sports, where you have this goal in mind. You have this goal in mind is to win the World Series.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, that was Bill Veeck's life, was winning and getting, I know.
Yeah.
And when they won it, he went back home, and after all the partying was over, he was alone. Right. And his son had told him, something about, I wish you were a scientist, something like that. That made us more famous. And Larry Doby goes back, even I guess years later, and like the next year even, and he's not a hero. He's not treated equally.
Yeah.
So the ending is not necessarily an ending, but it's extremely well done.
Yeah, loneliness is kind of a theme that runs throughout the
Yep.
book. I mean, Dobby experiences it, I think, most acutely. Feller does in that sort of last year of 1948, where he has a tough time making it through, and then he is sort of by himself after the Indians win the World Series. Paige is basically a loner. He's just kind of out for himself a lot, and so yeah, he becomes kind of a solitary individual. And then of course you have Bill Veeck, who is really kind of obsessed with winning the World Series. He dedicates so much of his life to it that he ends up sort of neglecting his family and his personal life. And then once it finally happens, he comes to the realization that he has no one there to celebrate it with.
Very sad. I'm a huge fan of your book in particular, and all books that do the, starting somewhere in the middle of the story. You start with the intro on August 20th, 1948. Which I believe was when Satchel had a shutout victory, and Larry Doby, did he give the RBI to win it?
Yeah, it was a 1-0 game, and Dobby gets the hit to win it, and he throws out a key batter to help Paige preserve victory, and he robs someone of a home run. So I thought that was the first game that is basically won by two black players. And it's, the Indians that year tie the Red Sox to make it to a sort of do or die playoff game. And so obviously if you don't win that game, which I don't think the Indians would have if they hadn't signed black players, the Indians don't make it to the World Series. Like that's the reason why they make it.
No doubt. You describe, the atmosphere, how Black Cleveland has that investment in the game as well, of course. And how important it is and how much excitement there is. And this could go at the beginning of the book. It could go at the end of the book. You write, quote, each in his own way, representing the four we've talked about, represented a different facet of the emerging integration saga that had just begun to play out among professional baseball. And I think that's a good place to leave it for talking about the book.
Yeah.
And congrats on the book. It's a great sports book if you're just into the sports. It's a great book about American culture. It's a great book about, about race. Very well done. And a question that some love to hear and some hate to hear. What's next for you? If I can interrupt, hablas mucho español, que dice en tu Twitter. ¿Vas a hablar más? ¿Vas a escribir un libro en español? ¿Qué?
Me encantaría escribir un libro en español,
Sí,
pero bueno,
okay.
yo creo que soy mejor en escribir en inglés que en español.
Okay, está bien.
But I really don't think that I can tell. I guess I would rephrase that. I really don't think I would ever find a better baseball story than this. I didn't know a lot about this story before I went into it. And so when I was really going through the archives and really doing the research on it, I was just shocked. I was just like, oh my gosh, this might be the greatest baseball story that anybody could ever come across. It had everything to it. It had all of the facets that make a fascinating story. In fact, I was worried that I wouldn't have enough to make a book, but at the end I was like, there's so much that, this could be a 500-page book. So I'm not even going to try. I am shifting into basketball right now.
Yes.
And I am, in about 2 weeks, I'm going to talk to my agent about the new book that I have come up with. So I am unfortunately not able to talk about it until then, but it's going to be a similar sort of thing that really takes a couple of players, tells a story through them, and builds up into a critical moment.
Well, thank you. I've actually already pre-ordered it, so don't worry about it. I've already
Nice.
pre-ordered the book that is not basketball is my favorite sport. Baseball is a great one, but yeah, I look forward to that one for sure. Do you? This is totally random, totally small thing. How good did it feel to put a sick SIC into your book? I always feel like that's one of the most underrated insults. Not that you use it as such, right? But
Yeah.
you could really use that to get to somebody, right? Like you, I know that you wrote something that's wrong.
Yeah.
I'm going to mention it, yet not, you know what I mean? How good did
Yeah.
that feel?
Felt all right.
Okay, okay, all right.
Some of the reporting back then was really, I mean, so one of the great things that I loved about doing the archives was that the sports writing in the 1940s and the 1930s is so colorful and so
Yes, no doubt.
um, now we would consider it to be over the top, purple
Mhm.
prose, sort of stuff
Yeah,
like that. But I loved it. I wish
uh-huh.
that people still wrote like that. I mean,
Right.
there was so much to quote from there because of the way that they were telling it. So,
Mhm.
sometimes they got things wrong and you had to sort of put a sick on them. But,
Yes.
gosh, I love reading that sports writing.
Well, that doesn't diminish from, is it Effa Manley?
Effa Manley, yeah.
There's a story to be written about her if it hasn't already been, right? What an
I had
incredible
to
story.
stop. I had to stop myself from writing like 50 pages about Effa Manley. I
Yeah.
think she is one of the most fascinating people in the
Hmm.
history of baseball, and she's getting her due now. But my goodness, what an incredible figure!
Fascinating is the word. I've taken a good chunk of your time. Do you want to read a little bit, or would you rather not? It's totally up to you.
Uh, I mean, do you think there's time? I don't know.
If you wanted to read something fairly short,
Okay,
yeah. Um, you know, there's
right.
there's
I've
a
got something.
page. You got some. Of course you
Yeah,
do. You
right
wrote
on.
the book. Of course you do. Go for it.
Okay. This comes whenever Bill Veeck has bought the Indians. He got severely injured during World War II to the point where he didn't know whether or not he was going to have to get his leg amputated, and he really should have, but put it off and put it off and put it off until the end of the 1946 season, whenever it became inevitable. So this is after Bill Veeck has bought the team and going into the 1947 season. The offseason came, but Bill Veeck didn't slow down. His October schedule was booked solid. He attended the 1946 World Series, jetted to Tucson for a quick visit with his family, and tore around Northern Ohio, speaking before as many groups and organizations as he could reach. Given the pain in his right foot, it was unsustainable. On October 22nd, Veeck stepped from the elevator of the Cleveland hotel where he lived and crumpled to the ground. Unable to stand, he crawled to his suite on his hands and knees. His itinerary called for him to give a talk at a Rotary Club the next day and then host a charity game in Massillon, a town about 60 miles south of Cleveland. He wouldn't think of canceling these engagements. Instead, he asked his secretary to set up a doctor's appointment upon his return. In the examination room, as soon as he glimpsed Veeck's swollen foot, the doctor sent him away to the Cleveland Clinic. There, a bedside phone was installed. Associates briefed him daily on all Indians matters. From early in the morning until late at night, a steady stream of visitors traipsed through his room. Every corner was littered with baskets of flowers, fruits, and cigarettes. Even though Veeck, as columnist Franklin Lewis put it, had been in more hospitals in a rented wheelchair over the past few years, it was different this time. The orthopedist laid down an ultimatum. The foot would have to come off. At 10 minutes past noon on November 1st, 1946, Veeck was wheeled into an operating room where surgeons sliced off his right leg 7 inches below the knee. At 4:30 that same afternoon, a call came into the sports department of the Cleveland Press. The voice on the other end was faint and sluggish. "This is Bill Veeck. How did those picks go at Cincy?" The Indians owner, still groggy from the effects of anesthesia, asked about that morning's minor league draft. Mere hours after his amputation, Veeck was already back to work. By all accounts, Veeck took the loss of his foot in stride. When sports writer Hal Leibovitz first visited the clinic after the operation, he found a bedridden Veeck playing with a slinky. More than 1,000 letters and 300 telegrams were piled up next to him. So many bouquets of flowers had poured in that Cleveland Forest had to start discouraging visit callers from placing orders. Veeck shrugged at the attention. "I said there would be changes made and players cut right and left when I bought the Indians last summer. And what happens? I'm the one who winds up getting cut. But it could have been worse. Bob Feller's right arm, for instance. I'd rather give a leg to the Indians than have anything happen to Bob's pitching arm." 17 days after his surgery, Veeck was discharged from the hospital. A truck was needed to haul away the mounds of gifts that had accumulated in the room. 2 months later, he was fitted for an artificial leg at the J.E. Hanger Company in downtown Pittsburgh. The one he chose was carved from English willow and fastened on with brown leather straps. After attaching the wooden limb, Veeck took a few uncertain strides forward. Then, according to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, a cocky grin spread over Veeck's face. Soon he began strutting up and down the store corridors. Take it easy, Bill, one of the clerks pleaded. A fellow shouldn't bite off more than he can chew at first. Depends on how big his mouth is, Veeck shot back, and with a flourish, he swung his new leg high like a dancer in a chorus line. Being rid of the crutches on which he'd hobbled about for the better part of 2 years was cause for celebration. His custom-tailored wooden leg was slated to arrive in Cleveland in late January. Veeck sent out invitations to a Back on My Feet dance scheduled for the day of its arrival. On the evening of January 28th, more than 300 guests filled the glamorous Vogue ballroom in Cleveland's Holland Inn Hotel. Veeck didn't hold back. He danced waltzes and rumbas, foxtrots and sambas, whatever the Sammy Watkins Orchestra threw at him. After a while, blood started to trickle down the wooden appendage that had been delivered only hours earlier, leaking onto the dance floor. If he was in pain, Veeck didn't let on until the last guest had retired. Then he limped to the elevator and collapsed upon reaching his floor. Just as he'd done 3 months earlier, he crawled on his hands and knees to his room. There, as Veeck later wrote in his autobiography, he discovered that the strain of dancing had rubbed his tender stump raw, and the blood, in drying, had glued it solidly to his wooden leg. He had to soak for hours in a hot tub afterward before the prosthetic unstuck itself. Afterward, according to Franklin Lewis, Veeck writhed in bed while ripping pains tore at the flesh of his stump.
Thank you for reading that. Thank you. A great point that I failed to mention. I mean, the whole Bill Veeck was incredible, even if he had both legs fully, formed, and he of course had the horrible injury and the partial amputation, and that made it even more amazing. We would all love to hear more from the book. Or do you have a good chance to pitch any upcoming appearances, readings, and website and the whole deal? We can find you on social media. Where would that be?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at let me make sure I get this right. I'm at Luke Epplin, and you can find my email there if you ever want to email me. There are signed books available through my local bookstore. That is Astoria Bookshop. So if you just Google Astoria Bookshop, look that up, you can get a signed copy through there. Cool. The paperback comes out on March 8th, and then there will be hopefully a little mini tour that is going to happen. I'm going to be speaking at the Tucson Book Festival, and then I do hope to go through Cleveland before the baseball season starts in the next year. So I'll definitely be posting on Twitter about that.
Oh, very cool. And now it's double P double, spell the last name, please.
Yeah, Luke, my first name, and then Epplin, at Luke Epplin.
Well, again, thank you for the book. I have the personal connection with Satchel Paige, which is so interesting, but I know the book has done very well, gotten a lot of attention, brought you a lot of attention that's well deserved. Thanks so much for reading. Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts. And it was such a pleasure talking to you, and great luck in the future. Suerte, mucha suerte.
Gracias.
Yes. Thank you so much for listening to episode 89 with Luke Epplin. You can now subscribe to the Chills at Will podcast on Apple Podcasts, and please leave a 5-star review. You can also ask for it by name using Alexa. Find it on Stitcher, Spotify, and on Amazon Music. Follow me on Instagram, where I'm at Chills at Will Podcast, or on Twitter, where I'm at Chills at Will PO1. You can watch this and other episodes on YouTube. Watch and subscribe to the Chills at Will podcast channel. This is a passion project of mine, a DIY operation, and I'd love for your help in promoting what I'm convinced is a unique and spirited look at an often ignored art form. The intro song for the Chills at Will podcast is Wind Down Instrumental, and the other song played on the episode was Hoops Instrumental by Matt Whitehour. Both songs are used through archesaudio.com. Please tune in for the next episode, a conversation with Bill Esparza. Bill Esparza is a professional musician, writer, and blogger whose travels throughout Latin America have made him a leading expert on Latin American cuisines. His original style of writing and passion for culture have made him a go-to source for magazines, newspapers, and food travel shows. Looking forward to sharing this episode with you starting November 9th. For now, thanks again for listening. And I hope that these quarantine days bring you texts by writers with mad skills like Luke Epplin, whose work, like Our Team, the epic story of 4 men in the World Series that changed baseball, give you chills at will.